Well, for more on the wildfires across Europe, we can bring in Stefan Doerr, director of the Center for Wildfire Research at Swansea University in the UK. Good morning, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Good morning, Alison.
We have these massive blazes we've seen underway in Spain and France, fires as far north as Scotland. Just how unprecedented is this year's wildfire season in Europe?
I mean, last year's wildfire season in Europe was quite extreme as well, with the largest area burned in recent years. But of course, now we have these simultaneous events occurring over Western Europe, in Spain, in France, and as we've just seen, also in Scotland. And this is quite unusual. Whether it's unprecedented in terms of the scale and the area that's going to be burned is perhaps less relevant. The key aspect here is that the resources are really stretched, and we're seeing extreme fire behavior, especially now in France, which is very, very challenging to battle.
Yeah, as you said, we had huge wildfires last year as well. Is this the new normal? How is climate change impacting wildfire patterns around the world?
I mean, globally, especially in forests, we see an increase in wildfire activity and also how extreme those fires burn. So how difficult it is actually for the fires to be put out. So for each hectare or kilometer square burned in forests nowadays, we basically see more energy being released. And that is essentially a sign that it's much, much more challenging to tackle. And right now, the heat dome that's been sitting over Western Europe, there's no question about this. This has been certainly promoted or become much more likely due to climate change. And globally, around the world, we see a longer fire season nearly everywhere, in virtually all places around the world. And we also see more extreme fire seasons around the world. So climate change certainly has a contributing factor here. But there are other factors that play a role.
Can you talk about those other factors? I mean, what is making these fires in Spain and France so difficult to combat?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what we see certainly in some areas in the Mediterranean is that we have more fuel in the landscape, or rather, we have more vegetation in the landscape that was in the past more intensively managed. We would have more grazing, we had more agricultural activity, and as more people move away from the countryside into the cities, we have a proliferation of shrubs, of grasses, and often we also have trees planted in those areas, which fundamentally is great in terms of sucking up carbon from the atmosphere, but it also makes the landscape more flammable if we have these very dry conditions that we've now had for a long time. So it's really a combination of factors that making this situation especially challenging.
Yeah, you mentioned the trees that are planted. I wanted to ask you, one of the dilemmas that sort of comes up in terms of fire prevention is that vegetation is also important to the environment. So how do you find the right balance?
It is very challenging. I mean, there's some trees that are much more flammable than others. So, for example, pine trees or eucalyptus trees that we sometimes see planted in areas, especially in the Mediterranean, they are very flammable. That's not to say we shouldn't have at least native trees planted in some areas, absolutely. But one thing that can be done is actually generate fire breaks between those. So have areas where there are big breaks of vegetation, and also make sure that the vegetation below those trees is not accumulating. And what we've seen is essentially all the footage that you had in the program is a relatively rich area. When I say rich, in terms of vegetation, below the trees, often cured dried grasses, and they can transport the fire very quickly. If we then have shrubs amongst those, they can then transport those flames into the trees. And once the fire is in the tree crowns, like has happened certainly in France and also in Spain, it's extremely difficult to put out. So these fires then jump from crown to crown. The flames can be propagated quite some distances also from embers. And once the fires reach a certain size, they're extremely difficult to fight.
France's Gironde department also saw major fires just 4 years ago. Is it possible that some of the same areas are burning again so soon afterwards?
In principle, yes. Grasses that are the key driver to propagate fires immediately, they come back the next year. So that's certainly one aspect. Shrubs can grow pretty well as well. Trees themselves, of course, take longer to grow. But if the trees are still alive after the previous fire, the vegetation can certainly accumulate quite quickly within a few years to generate enough fuel. And another factor that we've had this year in some areas certainly is we had a relatively wet spring, for example, in Spain, but also here in the UK. And that allows grass growth in particular very well, and therefore we have a new set of fuels, probably more than we would have normally after a normal spring. So that combination is also generating exceptional fire conditions now.
So, in terms of land management, then, what do authorities need to be doing to help prevent fires?
Yeah, we basically across Europe, I think it's fair to say that we need to move more resources from simply firefighting capability to managing the land. And in Portugal now, we're actually spending more money on prevention of fire than actually on firefighting. So the balance is shifting in the right direction. But basically, as we abandon areas in rural regions, we need to deal with them in some way. And one thing that's spun, again, you saw some images earlier of sheep, is actually grazing. Sheep and cattle, goats, but also horses are actually quite effective in keeping the landscape open up to a point that reduces the risk of fire, and then it makes it easier for firefighters to intersect a fire and stop it at those areas that have less vegetation. But of course, that's only one way of actually dealing with that.
And is land management sort of being spearheaded by governments, or is it something that individuals should also be undertaking to help prevent their communities from being burned?
Absolutely. I mean, many communities actually are taking action these days. In some areas, you can actually rent goats. This is also something people do in California, for example, rent a goat to actually reduce fuel. So both governments, as well as individuals, as landowners, as communities, can act there. And this is something quite powerful. This is not necessarily going to stop the most extreme fires in forests once they've taken hold. But generally speaking, this is certainly one aspect that can reduce fire risk. And we need to do this into the future. Absolutely.
These fires are moving towards big urban areas like Bordeaux and Madrid. I'm curious, could they spread into urban areas, or are they likely to sort of stay outside?
That's a very important question. Now, we've seen this in Los Angeles last year. Of course, fires can spread into built-up areas through what we call the wild and urban interface, and especially in the United States, of course, many houses are built from wood, and they catch fire very easily. Now, in Europe, most structures are made of brick and stone, but it's not to say that they cannot burn. So fundamentally, it is possible that fires move into urban areas, especially, again, if we have fuels in those areas, such as shrubs, grasses, so they can then transform into those areas. Fortunately, there are more breaks, fire breaks or vegetation breaks in those urban areas. So when the fire reaches those areas, the firefighters are more likely to be able to stop it. But the other side of the coin is once we have vehicles, houses, and other infrastructure burning, they can then propagate the fire very easily from structure to structure. And essentially then not the vegetation that provides the fuel for the fires. We then are dealing with an urban conflagration. That is certainly a possibility. Again, I would say less likely in many cities of Europe, but it's not something that is impossible.
What impact do these kinds of extreme fires tend to have on the broader ecosystem?
Many impacts. Of course, the obvious thing is animals and plants, though. So, if, for example, the trees tend to be destroyed. One of the issues in Scotland at the moment is whether those pine trees that up there will survive or not. The older ones probably will. The younger ones will likely to be killed. But the vegetation usually recovers. It takes some time, but the more serious impacts are actually longer lasting. Because once you've actually removed the forest completely from the landscape, it takes quite a long time to recover, and it doesn't necessarily recover to the same level. One thing we're seeing in Scotland right now is fires in upland area and moorland areas. So here we have carbon that's locked up in the soil, which carries more carbon or contains more carbon than the vegetation above the ground. And that carbon is lost to the atmosphere due to fires for a long time. It's built up over hundreds, sometimes thousands of years, and especially in Scotland, this is something that's then very, very difficult to recover. We need thousands of years for this carbon to be put into the ground. So from a carbon perspective and carbon emissions perspective, that's certainly one aspect that's quite tragic now.
We will continue, of course, to follow these fires and their effects. Stefan Doerr, thank you again so much for bringing us your insight this morning. That was Stefan Doerr, Director of the Centre for Wildfire Research at Swansea University in the UK.